Most people believe character is revealed in moments of pressure, crisis, or visible struggle. They imagine that hardship alone forges integrity, that pain automatically produces depth, and that comfort weakens the soul. But life is far more subtle than that. The most decisive tests of character do not arrive wearing the costume of disaster. They arrive quietly, disguised as relationships. They come in the form of connection, intimacy, trust, and emotional proximity. And because they feel familiar, people often fail them without ever realizing they were being examined. Relationship is where the unconscious is activated. When another human being gets close enough, they touch the hidden parts of us that no achievement, title, or external success ever reaches. Power can be worn like a mask. Status can be performed. Strength can be rehearsed. But relationship exposes who a person is when there is nothing to hide behind. How someone listens, reacts, withdraws, attacks, envies, or avoids tells a far deeper story than how they perform under pressure alone. Comfort rarely threatens the ego. Relationship does. When someone is comfortable, they remain in control. Their identity stays intact. Their self-image remains unquestioned. But when they enter a meaningful relationship, especially with someone emotionally aware, present, or authentic, the illusion of control begins to crack. Old wounds surface. Insecurities awaken. Shadow traits emerge, not because the other person caused them, but because closeness removes the usual defenses. This is why relationships feel destabilizing to many people. They are not failing because the relationship is wrong. They are being tested by the mirror it holds up. A partner, friend, or confidant reflects back unresolved grief, unexamined fear, and unintegrated desire. The test is never about perfection. It is about responsibility. Will the person take ownership of what is being revealed, or will they project it outward? Projection is one of the most common ways people fail relational tests. Instead of asking, "What is this situation showing me about myself?" they ask, "Why is this person doing this to me?" Blame replaces reflection. Defense replaces curiosity. Control replaces vulnerability. In that moment, character is revealed, not through cruelty, but through avoidance. True character shows up in how someone handles emotional friction. Do they listen when uncomfortable truths are spoken, or do they shut down? Do they become curious about their reactions, or do they justify them? Do they grow quieter and more attentive, or louder and more self-righteous? Relationship demands humility, because another person's experience cannot be controlled, only respected. One of the most difficult relational tests is the presence of someone who does not need you to be impressive. Someone who values honesty over performance, threatens the ego deeply. Without admiration to hide behind, a person must face their inner contradictions. Many choose to sabotage these connections, not consciously, but instinctively. Distance feels safer than exposure. Superficial harmony feels safer than real intimacy. Another test appears in moments of misunderstanding. Character is not shown by never being misunderstood, but by how one responds when it happens. Does the person rush to defend their image, or do they slow down and seek understanding? Do they punish withdrawal or invite dialogue? Do they need to win, or do they need to connect? These small moments accumulate into a pattern that quietly defines who someone is becoming. Relationship also tests integrity when no immediate consequence exists. How someone speaks about others when they are not present, how they honor emotional boundaries, how they handle trust when it could be exploited, all reveal more than dramatic moral decisions ever could. These are the unseen moments where character is either integrated or fractured. Many people believe they are good because they have never been tested by pain. In truth, they have simply never been tested by closeness. Relationship demands emotional accountability. It asks a person to recognize their impact, not just their intention. It reveals whether someone can hold complexity without collapsing into defense or denial. The irony is that people often pray for growth while resisting the very relationships that would bring it. They ask for purpose, but avoid the discomfort of self-examination. They want transformation, but reject the mirrors life places in front of them. Relationship is not meant to be comfortable. It is meant to be revelatory. Life does not test character by removing comfort alone. It tests character by offering connection and watching what a person does with the truth that emerges when another human being truly sees them. There is a quiet psychological law at work in human relationships that few people are willing to face honestly. The traits, behaviors, and attitudes that provoke the strongest emotional reactions in us are rarely random. They are not simply signs of moral clarity or superior awareness. More often, they are indicators of something unresolved within our own inner world. What we reject in others frequently points toward unfinished work we have avoided confronting in ourselves. Rejection is rarely neutral. Indifference does not carry emotional charge, but irritation, contempt, disgust, or moral outrage do. When a person's presence or behavior feels disproportionately disturbing, it is worth asking why, not because the other person is innocent or perfect, but because emotional intensity is information. The psyche reacts most strongly when something familiar but unintegrated is activated. People tend to reject in others what they were never allowed to fully experience or express themselves. A person who was punished for vulnerability may feel contempt toward emotional openness. Someone who learned early that anger was dangerous may react strongly to assertiveness. Another who was shamed for ambition may criticize confidence as arrogance. These reactions feel justified, even virtuous, yet they often protect an inner wound rather than reflect objective truth. The mind prefers moral narratives to self-examination. It is easier to label others as toxic, selfish, weak, or irresponsible than to investigate the internal tension their presence stirs. Rejection becomes a defense, a way to keep uncomfortable material out of conscious awareness. In this sense, judgment is not clarity but avoidance disguised as certainty. This does not mean that every negative reaction is projection or that harmful behavior should be excused. Discernment and boundaries are necessary. The distinction lies in the intensity and rigidity of the response. When rejection becomes obsessive, emotionally charged, or repetitive across different relationships, it signals a pattern. Patterns point inward before they point outward. Unfinished inner work often originates in early adaptation. As children, people learn which traits earn approval and which invite rejection. Qualities that threaten belonging are pushed into the unconscious. Over time, these disowned parts do not disappear. They seek expression indirectly, often through projection onto others. The external world becomes a screen onto which unresolved inner conflicts are displayed. This is why certain people seem to trigger us without clear reason. They embody traits we have split off from ourselves. Their existence threatens the internal balance we have constructed to survive. Rather than reintegrate these parts, the psyche attempts to eliminate the threat externally through rejection, criticism, or withdrawal. Moral superiority often masks inner disconnection. When a person feels whole, they do not need to condemn difference so aggressively. They can recognize flaws without collapsing into contempt. Strong rejection, especially when paired with self-righteousness, suggests an identity built on exclusion rather than integration. The unfinished work within us is not always negative traits. Sometimes we reject qualities we secretly long for. Freedom, confidence, authenticity, or emotional expressiveness can provoke resentment when they highlight our own inhibition. Envy disguises itself as critique. Desire disguises itself as disdain. The psyche protects itself from longing by turning it into rejection. This dynamic plays out powerfully in close relationships. Partners, friends, and family members often carry projections for one another. What irritates us most in those closest to us is rarely accidental. Intimacy dissolves distance, making projection harder to avoid. The closer the relationship, the more likely unfinished inner material will surface. Growth begins when rejection is questioned rather than acted upon reflexively. This does not require self-blame or self-erasure. It requires curiosity. Asking what a reaction is protecting can reveal where development has been stalled. The goal is not to accept everything, but to understand why certain things feel intolerable. Integration does not mean becoming what we reject. It means acknowledging the psychological energy bound up in the rejection and reclaiming it consciously. A person who integrates their shadow gains flexibility. They can respond rather than react. They can set boundaries without hatred. They can disagree without needing to destroy. The more inner work a person completes, the less compulsive their judgments become. They still discern, but they no longer need rejection to define themselves. Their sense of identity expands, becoming less dependent on opposition. What once provoked anger becomes information. What once triggered avoidance becomes insight. The unfinished work within us does not announce itself politely. It arrives through irritation, judgment, and emotional disturbance. Every strong rejection is an invitation not to excuse others, but to understand ourselves more honestly. The traits we cannot tolerate in others often guard the doorway to the parts of ourselves that are waiting to be seen, understood, and integrated. The ego is not inherently destructive, but it is deeply invested in control. Its primary function is to maintain a stable sense of identity, to protect continuity, and to ensure psychological survival. Control provides certainty, and certainty provides safety. From the ego's perspective, growth is dangerous because it threatens familiar structures. Humility, which requires surrendering the illusion of control, feels like collapse rather than expansion. Most people misunderstand growth as accumulation. They believe becoming more evolved means knowing more, achieving more, or mastering more aspects of life. In reality, growth often requires the opposite. It demands the willingness to admit limitation, to confront ignorance, and to accept that one's current self is incomplete. This moment, when the ego must step back rather than step forward, is where many fail. Control allows the ego to preserve narrative dominance. As long as a person can explain themselves, justify their behavior, and maintain moral superiority, the ego remains intact. Humility disrupts this narrative. It introduces uncertainty. It asks a person to listen rather than speak, to observe rather than dominate, to learn rather than defend. For the ego, this feels like losing ground. The critical moment of failure often arrives quietly. It appears during feedback, disagreement, or emotional confrontation. Someone points out an inconsistency, a blind spot, or a pattern. Growth would require reflection. Humility would require openness. But the ego interprets this as threat. Rather than integrating the information, it moves to regain control through dismissal, defensiveness, or attack. This is why intelligent and capable people often struggle with inner development. Intellectual strength can become an armor that protects the ego from humility. The more articulate a person is, the easier it becomes to rationalize instead of reflect. Explanations replace insight. Logic replaces accountability. Control is re-established, but growth is postponed. Humility is not self-negation. It is not weakness or submission. It is the capacity to remain present when the self-image is challenged. It is the ability to say, "I may be wrong," without collapsing into shame. This capacity is rare because it requires emotional resilience. The ego fears that if control is loosened, the self will disintegrate. Many people equate control with strength because they were never shown another model. Early environments often reward dominance, certainty, and confidence, while punishing uncertainty and vulnerability. As a result, humility becomes associated with danger or loss of status. When growth demands humility, it collides with deeply ingrained survival strategies. Relationships are where this conflict becomes most visible. Intimacy exposes the limits of control. Another person cannot be managed in the same way as circumstances or outcomes. When emotional friction arises, the ego attempts to restore dominance. It may withdraw, manipulate, intellectualize, or assert authority. Each tactic reasserts control while avoiding the humility required for genuine connection. Growth requires tolerating discomfort without immediately resolving it. Humility means allowing confusion, not knowing, and emotional exposure to exist without rushing to control the narrative. This suspension feels unbearable to the ego. The impulse to explain, correct, or overpower is strong because it promises relief. Failure at this moment does not always look dramatic. It often looks like subtle rigidity, a refusal to apologize sincerely, an inability to listen without preparing a defense, a need to be right even at the cost of connection. These small choices accumulate, gradually solidifying the ego while stalling development. The paradox is that the ego believes it is protecting the self, but it is often protecting outdated structures. Growth demands the courage to let parts of identity die so that something more integrated can emerge. Humility is the gateway to this process. Without it, change remains superficial. Those who repeatedly fail this moment often seek external validation instead of inner transformation. They pursue achievement, admiration, or control over others to compensate for the inner stagnation. The ego expands horizontally rather than vertically. There is more influence, but not more depth. True growth reorganizes the psyche from the inside out. It requires relinquishing the need to control perception, outcome, and narrative. Humility allows information to enter the system without distortion. It permits learning from experience rather than defending against it. The moment when growth demands humility is brief but decisive. It arrives as a choice between defending who one has been and becoming who one could be. Many fail not because they lack potential, but because they mistake control for safety and humility for threat. Most people believe truth reveals itself through grand declarations, public stands, or dramatic moments of moral courage. They imagine truth as something proven under bright lights, witnessed by others, and validated by recognition. Yet the most authentic expressions of truth rarely occur in public view. They surface in quiet moments, when no applause is expected, no approval is offered, and no reward is promised. Truth does not need witnesses to exist, but it does require integrity to be chosen. When rewards are present, behavior becomes complicated. Incentives shape actions, often unconsciously. Praise, status, belonging, and security all exert pressure on the psyche. Under these conditions, it becomes difficult to distinguish truth from performance. People say what is rewarded. They believe what keeps them accepted. They act in ways that maintain advantage. The presence of reward does not automatically negate sincerity, but it always introduces distortion. Truth emerges more clearly in its absence. When there is nothing to gain, motivation simplifies. The ego, deprived of external reinforcement, loses interest. What remains is character. How someone behaves when they could easily benefit from deception reveals far more than how they behave when honesty is celebrated. This is why private choices carry greater psychological weight than public ones. Being unobserved removes the need for consistency with an image. In public, identity must be maintained. People protect their reputations, roles, and narratives. In private, the self-image loosens. Habits, values, and impulses operate with less constraint. The discrepancy between public persona and private behavior is not hypocrisy by default, but it does expose the tension between truth and adaptation. Many individuals are sincere only under surveillance. They act ethically because consequences are visible. Rules are followed because enforcement exists. Kindness is extended because recognition follows. These behaviors are not meaningless, but they are conditional. Truth, by contrast, is unconditional. It persists even when doing the right thing costs something and yields nothing tangible in return. The absence of witnesses also removes the temptation to justify. When no one is watching, there is no audience to persuade. Actions speak without commentary. The psyche reveals its true priorities through what it chooses to do or not do in these moments. Avoidance, indulgence, responsibility, or restraint all become forms of silent confession. This is why trust is built not on promises but on patterns. What someone does consistently when unobserved eventually shapes who they become. Repeated private choices form internal structure. Over time, these structures surface externally, often surprising both the individual and those around them. Truth cultivated in solitude eventually asserts itself in relationship. There is also a deeper dimension to this idea. When no reward is guaranteed, truth becomes an inner alignment rather than an external transaction. It is no longer about exchange. There is no bargain with the world. Acting truthfully becomes a way of being rather than a strategy. This internal coherence creates psychological stability that cannot be produced through validation alone. Many people fear these unobserved moments because they expose inner fragmentation. Without external guidance, uncertainty emerges. Questions arise about values, purpose, and responsibility. It becomes clear where conviction is genuine and where it is borrowed. This confrontation can be unsettling, which is why distraction is so common. Silence invites truth, and truth demands response. The courage to face these moments is not heroic in appearance. It often looks mundane. Choosing honesty when lying would be easier. Showing restraint when indulgence would go unnoticed. Treating others with respect when there is no social cost to indifference. These choices do not announce themselves, but they accumulate into integrity. Integrity is not proven through declarations of belief, but through consistency across contexts. When behavior remains aligned regardless of observation, truth has been internalized. It no longer depends on external enforcement or reward. It has become part of the individual structure. The world tends to reward performance more readily than integrity, because performance is visible. Truth is quieter. It resists spectacle. It does not compete for attention. Yet it exerts a subtle influence over time. People sense it even when they cannot articulate it. Trust forms not because of what is said, but because of what is reliably done. Moments without reward are often mistaken for insignificance. They feel small, forgettable, and unimportant. In reality, they are decisive. They are the moments when values are either reinforced or eroded. Each private choice strengthens a particular orientation toward reality. Truth does not demand perfection, it requires congruence. It asks that actions, values, and inner experience align as closely as possible. This alignment cannot be faked indefinitely. It must be practiced where no one is watching, where shortcuts are available, and where the ego has little to gain. Over time, those who choose truth in these conditions develop an internal authority that does not depend on approval. Their sense of rightness comes from coherence rather than consensus. They are less easily swayed because their values are lived, not merely stated. Truth appears when no reward is guaranteed, because only then is it chosen for its own sake. It appears when no one is watching, because only then is it free from performance, revealing the quiet structure of a person's inner life. There is a tendency to explain failure in moral terms. When people hurt others, repeat destructive patterns, or betray what is meaningful, they are often labeled as cruel, malicious, or intentionally harmful. This framing provides emotional clarity, but it oversimplifies human behavior. Many failures are not the result of deliberate wrongdoing. They emerge from unconsciousness, from a lack of awareness about inner motives, fears, and patterns that quietly govern behavior. Unconsciousness does not mean ignorance in an intellectual sense. A person may be intelligent, articulate, and socially functional, while remaining deeply unaware of their internal dynamics. Unconsciousness refers to living without reflective contact with one's inner world. Actions arise automatically, driven by habit, fear, and unresolved emotional material rather than conscious choice. When someone is unconscious, they experience their reactions as facts rather than signals. Anger feels justified, not informative. Withdrawal feels necessary, not avoidant. Control feels protective, not compensatory. Without awareness, the individual cannot distinguish between present reality and past conditioning. Old emotional responses are applied to new situations without examination. This is why unconscious people often repeat the same mistakes while insisting that circumstances are different. They are not lying. From their perspective, the problem is always external. They do not see the pattern because they are inside it. Responsibility feels like accusation because self-observation has not been developed as a capacity. Unconsciousness also explains why some people harm those closest to them while maintaining a positive self-image. Without insight into their inner conflicts, they rationalize behavior that contradicts their values. The psyche protects itself through justification. Intentions are emphasized while impact is minimized. This gap between intention and consequence is a hallmark of unconscious behavior. Failure rooted in unconsciousness often appears as inconsistency. Promises are made sincerely but not kept. Commitments feel genuine in the moment but dissolve under pressure. Emotional reactions surprise even the person experiencing them. These failures are not planned. They emerge when unconscious material overwhelms conscious intention. Relationships amplify unconsciousness. Intimacy activates early attachment patterns, unmet needs, and unresolved trauma. Without awareness, these forces hijack behavior. A person may sabotage closeness while believing they are protecting themselves. They may project inner fear onto others, interpreting threat where none exists. In these moments, failure is not chosen, it happens automatically. Moral condemnation does little to address this kind of failure. Shame increases defensiveness, which further entrenches unconscious patterns. Awareness, not punishment, is the prerequisite for change. Until a person can observe their own reactions, they remain governed by them. Unconsciousness is often reinforced by social norms. Many environments reward productivity, confidence, and conformity while discouraging introspection. Emotional awareness is treated as weakness. Reflection is postponed in favor of action. Over time, this external focus atrophies inner perception. People learn to function without understanding themselves. This does not absolve responsibility. Unconsciousness explains behavior, but it does not excuse its impact. Growth requires the willingness to become conscious of one's patterns, regardless of how uncomfortable that process may be. The tragedy is that many people never undertake this work, not because they are incapable, but because the cost feels too high. Becoming conscious threatens identity. It requires acknowledging contradiction, vulnerability, and limitation. For some, the ego's need for coherence outweighs the desire for truth. They choose familiarity over insight. In doing so, they remain trapped in cycles that appear fated but are actually unexamined. Failure rooted in unconsciousness often looks like avoidance. Difficult conversations are postponed indefinitely. Accountability is deflected. Patterns are repeated with different people and different settings, yet the emotional outcome remains the same. Without awareness, learning cannot occur. The most painful aspect of unconscious failure is that it often harms both the individual and others. Opportunities are lost, relationships erode, trust is damaged, yet the person remains confused about why life feels repetitive and unfulfilling. They sense dissatisfaction but cannot locate its source. Awareness begins when reactions are questioned rather than obeyed. When a person pauses long enough to ask what they are feeling and why, unconscious material starts to surface. This process is destabilizing, which is why it is avoided, but without it, failure remains inevitable. Some people fail not because they lack morality, but because they lack awareness. They are not choosing destruction, they are reenacting unresolved patterns. Until consciousness replaces automaticity, behavior will continue to undermine intention, and lessons will repeat themselves in different forms, waiting to be recognized